Welcome back, everybody, to our ongoing discussion of cellular activities. In this presentation, we are looking at cell respiration, one of the two major biochemical pathways that we need to discuss this semester. This is Chapter 6, as the slide indicates, and we are 6 weeks into the semester, or at least at the end of this week, we will be 6 weeks into the semester. And that means we have reached the halfway point of the semester, in case you hadn't realized that. Of course, we've got the second exam coming up, which is the second of 4 exams throughout the course of the semester, not including the final. So that makes sense that we should be having all of this come together at the middle of the semester, about halfway through the semester. So if you have not started prepping for the second exam, it might be a good idea to start prepping for that as well. But today we are looking at Chapter 6, Cell Respiration. And we are going to be bringing together much of the concepts about chemistry and energy processing that we've been learning over the course of the last 4 or 5 chapters. Or at least the last 4 chapters. And so it's really important that if some of that is still a little bit fuzzy for you, that you go back and you take a really good look at that material, because it will really help you come to terms with this chapter. It's the reason why we've done all of the preceding chapters, so that this chapter and Chapter 7, which is the chapter on photosynthesis, are a lot easier to understand, because you should already have a solid foundation of the chemical processes and chemical concepts that you're going to see played out here in this chapter and the next chapter. And I am going to introduce you to a couple of concepts that are kind of hinted at in the chapter without really being defined very clearly for you, particularly the notion of reduction and oxidation reactions, because they are at the heart of understanding both cell respiration and photosynthesis. And they tell us something about the energetics of these reactions as well, and how those energetics reflect what we've already learned about the laws of thermodynamics from our previous chapters, and how those relate to the chemical reactions of cell respiration, and when we get into the next chapter, photosynthesis. So there will be a little bit of extra information trying to tie together some concepts for you and to help you make sense of what we're looking at today and in the next chapter, in next week's chapter as well, which is the photosynthesis chapter. So you may find some things that you may not have really paid attention to in the textbook. That's because the textbook tends to downplay them, but I want to make sure that you're very clear about these concepts, because they help you understand them at a little bit of a deeper level and make these processes a little bit easier to understand. But before we get into the basic chemistry, and we talk about the stages of cell respiration, let's stop for a minute and talk about our own ability to process energy in the form of muscle activity. And we're all familiar with this concept of muscles being an energy burner. In fact, if you want to lose weight, if you're carrying a little bit too much extra fat, which a lot of us find we do as we get older, some of us more than others, probably won't go there, then one of the ways that you can maximize your ability to lose all of that weight that you want to get rid of, particularly the fat, is by increasing the size of your muscles, because your muscles are the major energy burning tissue in your body. And they do so by primarily using glucose. That's their preferred fuel. So glucose, as we've discovered previously, is a carbohydrate. So this is one of the reasons why we should never ignore carbohydrates as part of our food intake, because they are the primary fuel that our cells prefer to burn. Now, as you'll see a little bit later in the chapter, fortunately, cells are not restricted to just burning glucose. If that was the case, then we would be wasting as a fuel source the protein and the fats that we take in, but we know that those also represent a source of energy. And it's one of the reasons why when we talk about survival of our body, and I've introduced you to this concept previously, the notion of the triple threes. You can live for about 3 minutes without oxygen. You can live for about 3 days without water. You can live for about 3 months without food, about 60 to 70 days. And the reason why is because your body, your cells, can also use protein and fat as a source of energy. So if it doesn't have carbohydrate available, then it prefers to use protein, which is your muscle, before it uses the fat. And this is one of the reasons why, as you deny your body carbohydrates, you find that your muscles start to suffer. Because unless you make sure that you are providing sufficient amino acid to keep your muscle bulk up, it will start to decrease because the body starts to self-digest the muscle. It really does. And its preference is to break down the muscle tissue before it attacks the fat, because it views the fat as being a long-term source of energy and only to be utilized in an emergency. And that emergency is when there is nothing else to utilize. So one of the things that we always need to recognize when we start playing with our food intake and the ratio of the different types of food molecules in our food intake is that our body usually will outmaneuver us no matter what we try to do, because it has its own way of doing things. And as much as we might think, well, if I manipulate this and manipulate that and manipulate something else, I can get around what the body chooses to do, the reality is the body will always outmaneuver us. And so we have to learn to work within the parameters that our body has already established. And one of those is glucose is the primary fuel, preferred fuel. And when we do take in protein and fat, if we don't have carbohydrate, it's going to turn those into carbohydrate. And you'll see how a little bit later in this chapter. It's not as efficient, it's not as effective, but because the body prefers glucose, and most cells prefer glucose, and certainly the brain prefers glucose, that's what it does. The other big thing, of course, is that there is a requirement for oxygen. And so we refer to what cells normally do as aerobic metabolism or aerobic cell respiration, because there is this requirement for oxygen to maximize the energy output by burning the fuel molecules, whatever they happen to be. But in the absence of oxygen, or in reduced amounts of oxygen, if there was an absolute dependence on oxygen, that would not turn out well, because it would mean that our cells would no longer be able to function. So there are alternative ways for cells to function, and this is true of your muscles as much as it is of other cells in the body and cells in other organisms. Now, some organisms, as we'll discover in this chapter, really can function in the absence of oxygen. In fact, that's their preferred way of doing things. And we refer to that as anaerobic respiration, respiration in the absence of oxygen. Now, there are two different types of anaerobic respiration. One we typically refer to as fermentation, but it is a form of anaerobic respiration. And then there is a form of anaerobic respiration that utilizes the same chemical pathways as aerobic respiration, but uses molecules other than oxygen as the final destination of electrons. And one of the things that we're going to discover as we talk about cell respiration is that it really is all about the electrons. And when we talk about extracting energy out of food, what we're really talking about is extracting electrons out of the food molecules, and again, primarily glucose, in such a way that we can extract energy out of those electrons, because electrons have potential energy. And what life is doing is harvesting or tapping into the potential energy of those electrons through chemical reactions. And so one of the things that we need to identify as we talk about cell respiration, and specifically aerobic respiration, but also this alternative form of anaerobic respiration, is how can we actually tap into the potential energy of electrons in such a way that we can utilize some of their potential energy to generate ATP, because that's what this is really all about. Using the potential energy of the electrons of our food molecules to provide a source of energy to drive the synthesis of ATP. So those are the things that we really need to pay attention to. So when we talk about aerobic capacity, something that exercise physiologists like to measure, and if you ever take a physiology class, you may get an opportunity to measure your aerobic capacity. If you're a member of a gym, it's possible that if you talk to one of the trainers at the gym, they may be able to hook you up with a way of measuring aerobic capacity. When you do what we refer to as cardio exercises or aerobic exercise, what we're really talking about is improving your aerobic capacity, your ability to transport oxygen from your lungs through your red blood cells to the muscles primarily, because that's where the energy burn is taking place when you do the exercise. But it's a benefit to all of your body, because if you can transport oxygen more efficiently and more effectively, every cell in your body benefits from having access to that extra oxygen. But it doesn't matter how good your aerobic capacity is. Eventually, some of the muscle is going to get to the point where it simply cannot get enough oxygen. You cannot transport enough oxygen over longer periods of time to prevent some of your muscles from going anaerobic, from having to function in the absence of oxygen, or at least in the presence of reduced levels of oxygen. And when that happens, your cells switch over to a form of anaerobic respiration that is tied to the fermentation process. And in the case of your muscles, it results in the production of a substance called lactate or lactic acid. And there's some controversy about the role of lactic acid and lactate in the function of muscles, because early on, and we'll talk about this at the end of the chapter in a little bit more detail, there was evidence that suggested that the buildup of lactic acid in muscle was the cause of muscle cramps, a Charlie horse. It is a reflection of the fact that your muscles have gone anaerobic. They're not getting enough oxygen. And so the lactic acid builds up as a consequence of the fermentation process as an emergency way of making energy, making ATP. But because it doesn't make as much energy, it doesn't provide enough energy for the muscles to continue to function, and the muscles will eventually start to seize up. And it hurts. I mean, if you've had a muscle cramp, and who hasn't, you know that it hurts. And that pain is your signal to stop. I mean, pain is nature's way of telling you that you're doing something that you shouldn't ought to be doing. And it's a way of telling you to stop doing what you're doing, because if you keep doing it, nothing good will ever come of that. Damage will occur. And the initial evidence suggested that it was the lactic acid that was responsible for this. But as you'll see when we talk about the research at the end of the chapter, there is now a body of evidence that suggests that it's not the lactic acid. Even though it does still build up, it's probably not the lactic acid, or at least potentially not the lactic acid, that's causing the muscle cramps. Exactly what it is still the subject of research, because we're not entirely sure what it might be. It may be the reduced amount of ATP, that the buildup of lactic acid is just a symptom, but not the cause. And it may have more to do with the reduced amount of ATP that's being produced, not the presence of the lactic acid. That's still, as I said, a subject of ongoing research. We don't know exactly what the the situation is. But we'll revisit this again as part of this chapter when we get to the end, after we've talked a little bit in a lot more detail about cell respiration. But it is something that we need to be aware of, because it is really all about how our muscle works. It is really all about how our body works, whether we're talking about muscles, whether we're talking about the brain, whether we're talking about other cells in different tissues around the body. It really comes down to how efficiently do we process food molecules, how efficiently do we get oxygen to those cells in order to allow them to efficiently process the food molecules to maximize the level of ATP that they can generate in order to allow the cells to continue to function properly. There is more tied to this process, and we'll get into a little bit of that again towards the end of the chapter. So when we start thinking in terms of energy as a requirement for life, most of us are aware of the fact, if not before this class, at least as a function of what we've talked about previously, that energy enters into life, into ecosystems, into the biosphere, that area of the earth that life occupies, via sunlight. But sunlight is the ultimate energy source for all life on earth. And that puts plants in a very, very specific and very special position. We refer to plants as producers. They are the producers of all the energy-containing molecules that the rest of life is dependent upon. And we also refer to them as autotrophs. So the term autotroph, and let me write this in here, fire up the pen. Maybe I'll do it in black for the moment. So the term autotroph able to create food molecules from CO2 using light or chemical energy. And the reason why I put it that way is because in the case of plants, we refer to them as photoautotrophs, meaning they use light energy to create their own food molecules. But there are a group of microorganisms, bacteria primarily, and some archaea, that can utilize chemical energy to do the same thing. And we'll talk about them very briefly in the next chapter when we cover photosynthesis. But for the purposes of making organic molecules from carbon dioxide, an autotroph is the only type of organism that can do that, whether they're using sunlight energy, like plants and algae and anything else that carries out photosynthesis, or whether we're talking about these microorganisms that use chemical energy. An autotroph can make its own food molecules. Any other type of organism is referred to as a heterotroph. And heterotrophs have to get their carbon, their organic molecules, from an autotroph because they're incapable of making their own food molecules. So that includes ourselves as animals. We have to get our food molecules from plants or from eating other animals. We have no choice in the matter because we can't create our own food molecules out of carbon dioxide. So let me move this box out of the way for a minute and add the term, heterotroph here. And say that heterotrophs obtains food molecules So they obtain food molecules from eating other organisms. So basically that covers everything, whether we eat plants, whether we eat other animals, whether we eat fungi, whatever it is that we choose to eat. As a heterotroph, that's how we get our food molecules. We could also add in there that it's also a way of getting energy, because the vast majority of heterotrophs also get their energy from eating food molecules. So we describe ourselves as a chemoheterotroph, meaning we get our energy and we get our food molecules from eating other organisms. There is an alternative form of heterotrophism that is referred to as phototrophism. And as you might guess, as soon as we put the prefix photo in there, it's got something to do with light. And that means these organisms get their energy from light, but they get their food molecules from eating other organisms. So they don't use the light energy to make food molecules, but they can capture the light energy and they use that light energy. And this is where it gets kind of cool. They use that light energy to make ATP. And we'll see how that might be a benefit when we talk about photosynthesis in the next chapter. It actually ties us to photosynthesis. That's a little bit of an advanced understanding of what this energy processing thing is all about, but it starts to put into context why we have to think in terms of not just cellular respiration, but its connection to photosynthesis. Because as a heterotroph, we can't do cell respiration without the products of photosynthesis. It's pretty straightforward when we start thinking about that one. Let's think about it that way. So a lot of what we have to think about in terms of plants as autotrophs comes down to the fact that other than energy, the only thing that plants as photoautotrophs need is carbon dioxide and water. In terms of chemical intake, the only thing they really need is carbon dioxide and water. Using that and sunlight energy, they can make any type of food molecule, any type of organic molecule that they happen to need. So whether we're talking about the list here, the carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, or other types of organic molecules that they may need, so long as they have access to carbon dioxide, so long as they have access to water, so long as they have access to sunlight energy, they're good to go. They can make whatever they need. As heterotrophs, we don't have that luxury. We have to obtain our organic molecules from eating the producers, from eating the plants, the autotrophs. So when we start thinking in terms of ecosystems, when we start trying to name the ecosystems and identify different types of ecosystems, the way we do it is to look at the plants first, because it's the plants that are going to determine who else can live in that ecosystem, because only organisms that can utilize the plants that are there can live in that ecosystem. So at the base of every ecosystem are the plants as producers. They then determine what heterotrophs can occupy the same ecosystem, because it is really all about the plants. So that's just adding in what I've already stated, that it is really the plants that determine what heterotrophs can then occupy the ecosystem. So if you think about some ecosystems that you might be familiar with, a tropical rainforest, right? It's all about the plants. A prairie, it's all about the plants. The tundra, it's all about the plants. Any ecosystem that you might want to name, it's all about the plants. From that point onwards, then, what determines the rest of the ecosystem is the heterotrophs that are able to utilize the plants that are growing there. So they are at the heart, they are at the base of every ecosystem, and they serve to define that ecosystem. So when we think in terms of photosynthesis, again, it's the carbon dioxide and water that enters into the plants, enters into the plant cells, enters into the chloroplast, and are then utilized as the raw ingredients for making initially small sugar molecules, and we'll talk about those in the next chapter, which can then be assembled into glucose, which can be stored as starch in the chloroplast or can be transported elsewhere in the form of sucrose, table sugar. Sucrose is the main way that plants transport the products of photosynthesis to other locations within the plant to support the plant's growth. Those then become the raw materials for cell respiration, because when we think in terms of the typical equation for cell respiration, it's all about glucose as the primary fuel molecule. It is then utilized in the presence of oxygen, which happens to be the other byproduct of photosynthesis. And out of that breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen, and if that sounds a little bit like a burning process, then that's good, because it does resemble a burning process in terms of analogy, and that's the way we kind of think about it, but it's not a true burning process in the sense that we consider burning a piece of wood or burning a piece of paper or something like that. And out of that emerges carbon dioxide and water as the byproducts, the chemical byproducts of cell respiration, which you should recognize as being the raw materials for photosynthesis. So there is this chemical cycling between cell respiration and photosynthesis. So we see another connection between producers and consumers, or between photoautotrophs and heterotrophs. What the photoautotrophs are consuming as the reactants for photosynthesis turn out to be the chemical byproducts of cell respiration that the heterotrophs are utilizing to access the energy stored in the organic molecules that are produced by the photoautotrophs as a product of photosynthesis, the food molecules. And the other byproduct, oxygen, happens to be the other reagent or reactant for cell respiration. So you have a chemical cycling going on. And so this diagram kind of summarizes everything that I've been talking about, everything that you really need to know about this chemical recycling. So the first thing to recognize is that energy is never recycled. The laws of thermodynamics that we discussed in a previous chapter do not allow for that. So we can't recycle energy. So energy passes through in a linear fashion. So if we follow the path of energy, comes in as sunlight energy, gets stored in the organic molecules that are the product of photosynthesis and subsequent biochemistry in a plant. But let's just focus on glucose. The glucose is then processed in cell respiration so that we can extract the energy out and store it temporarily in ATP. So here's that energy coming out as ATP. And as we learned when we talked about the laws of thermodynamics and energy processing, ultimately all of that energy comes out as heat. And remember, heat is the energy of disorder. Remember the term entropy? So it is the energy of disorder, and while it is possible to use it as a source of kinetic energy in some circumstances for organisms, absolutely not. It is a form of energy that we cannot utilize. And so it becomes wasted energy that's released into the ecosystem. And this is the reason why the energy can't be recycled, because we can't utilize heat as a source of energy. In terms of chemical recycling, however, the story is very, very different. Let me use blue. Well, actually, let's not use blue. Let's use a different color, because the blue is used in the diagram. So I've turned on the purple. So in terms of reagents for cell respiration, or let's say byproducts. So these are our products of photosynthesis. Sorry that it's got cramped there, but if I go on to the black, you're not going to see it. But also reactants for cell respiration. So these are come in as the reactants for cell respiration. The products of cell respiration, the carbon dioxide and water, so we can put in here products we can put in here that these are the products of cell respiration, but they are also the reactants for photosynthesis. So they become the reactants for photosynthesis, which in turn produces our organic molecules and oxygen as the products of photosynthesis. So there's the chemical recycling. Looks a little messy, doesn't it? But it diagrams very nicely what we're talking about here. So we have this chemical recycling between cell respiration and photosynthesis, which is another reason as to why we talk about these back to back. We typically talk about cell respiration first because it's somewhat easier to understand as a process. So I guess it's a little bit easier to understand than photosynthesis. But the chemical principles that we're going to see played out here are the same chemical principles that are in play for photosynthesis. So one of the things to always remember as we're talking about cell respiration here is that the basic chemical principles, the movement of electrons and the source of electrons as a source of potential energy, is no different here in cell respiration than it is in photosynthesis. It's just the way you go about utilizing the electrons as a source of potential energy that is different. But the basic chemical principles here remain very much the same, whether we're talking about cell respiration or photosynthesis. And when we get into the next chapter next week, I'll strengthen those ties a little bit further as we talk about photosynthesis. So this is, again, a really good reason for why we should talk about cell respiration and photosynthesis together. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do with this chapter is try something a little bit different. And I have kind of teased that with you in a message that I sent out the other day in Canvas. And I'm going to break this up, not just by putting in a concept check, but I'm actually going to stop the recording and restart the recording again. So that's broken up into shorter recordings that might make it a little bit easier for you to look at. And I'll have multiple links on the resource page and also in the overview page that will allow you to directly move to the section of the recording that you want to get to under those circumstances. You can still look at the whole thing in one single recording, and there'll be a point or a link at the bottom left of each section that will allow you to click on it to move on to the next one. As you get to the end of one, you have the option of continuing on directly into the next one. Or you can stop and you can pick it up again by clicking on the link either in the overview or on the resource page, as I indicated. And I'll send out a message to explain this for everybody. But what I'm going to do is ask the concept check questions at the end of each of the recording breaks, and then answer the question at the beginning of the next section of recording. So here's the first concept check. This is where we're going to break, and that means that you can either move on if you want, or you can stop and pick it up again, and it'll be a little bit more convenient for you to pick it up. So here are the two concept check questions. As producers, plants can synthesize their own food. What are the only chemical ingredients plants require to do this? That's the first one. And secondly, what is misleading about saying plants carry out photosynthesis, animals carry out cellular respiration, which is actually a very common misconception amongst freshman biology students at all levels. So what is wrong about saying plants carry out photosynthesis and animals carry out cell respiration? If you're continuing on with me, click on the link below so that you go straight to the next recording. If you're not, I'll see you when you pick up the recording again with the answers to these questions.